North Carolina does not tell its abandoned stories in a loud way. It simply leaves everything there in silence and lets you figure out for yourself what happened. One valley was once the largest community in the Smokies, only to give way to a national park in the end. One county seat once held real political weight, then was wiped out by a cyclone so completely that today there is almost nothing left to see. It sounds more like fiction than fact, doesn't it? But that still is not the most unbelievable thing about North Carolina. Today we are stepping into 10 most abandoned cities in North Carolina, places that once had hundreds of residents, schools, churches, hotels, railroads, and even ports, only to disappear in ways no two places ever did alike. Because sometimes the most unsettling thing is not the ruin itself, but how quickly a place once full of life can turn into empty space. Number 10. Mortimer. Some towns fade out slowly. Mortimer did not. It was hit hard, pulled itself back together, and then got hit again so badly that the second blow finished what the first one started. That is what makes Mortimer different. This was not some tiny mountain outpost with a few cabins and a name on an old map. In the early 1900s, Mortimer was a real company town built by Ritter Lumber along Wilson Creek. At its height, it had around 800 people. It had a worker housing, a company store, a blacksmith shop, churches, a school, a hotel, and even a motion picture facility by about 1906. Local stories even say Theodore Roosevelt once stopped at the Laurel Inn. So no, Mortimer was not small in the way people imagine ghost towns to be. It had weight, it had movement, it had the kind of setup that makes a place feel like it is going to last. And for a while, it did. Mortimer lived on timber, rail, and noise. Logs came down from the mountains between Wilson Creek and Steel Creek on a narrow-gauge railroad. There was a time when the area around Mortimer and nearby Edgemont moved so much by train that the rail line felt like the town's bloodstream. Then 1916 came. First, a massive fire swept down from the Grandfather Mountain area. Then floodwater tore through the valley and wrecked the logging railroad. That part matters. Mortimer did not just lose buildings, it lost the very line that kept the lumber business alive. Ritter Lumber was gone not long after that. But here is the part that makes Mortimer harder to forget. It did not die the first time. In 1922, United Mills brought some life back. During the Depression, the CCC set up Camp F5 there and repaired damaged structures. In 1934, a hosiery mill opened in the old industrial area. Mortimer was trying to become something new. Not as strong as before, maybe, but not finished either. Then came August 13th, 1940. Wilson Creek rose again after a coastal storm system pushed inland. The flood hit with terrifying force, and this time the town had almost nothing left underneath it to fight back with. That, to me, is what makes Mortimer so heavy. It was not a place born weak. It was a place that survived one disaster only to face a second one after its economic backbone had already started to rot. And today, with old boilers, foundations, bits of machinery, and traces of the rail bed still near the creek, Mortimer does not feel completely gone. It feels like the bones of a town that almost made it back. Number 9, Lost Cove. If you hike into Lost Cove today, it does not look like a place that failed all at once. It looks like a place the world slowly forgot how to reach. A few chimney stacks, stone foundations, rusted tools, weathered graves, and strangest of all, the old Chevy of Swindmiller sitting in a ditch like nobody ever came back for it. That is the feeling Lost Cove leaves behind. Not disaster, not spectacle, just a long, quiet separation from the rest of the world. And that separation was always part of the story. Lost Cove sat high above the Nolichucky Gorge near the North Carolina and Tennessee line, buried so deep in Appalachian terrain that getting there was never simple. There was no easy road, no quick turnoff, no ordinary way in. People came by mountain trails or by following the railroad from Unaka Springs. If you lived there, distance was not an inconvenience. It was part of daily life. What makes the place harder to dismiss is how real it once was. At its peak, Lost Cove had around 100 people, roughly 13 to 15 homes, sawmills, farmland, orchards, a cemetery, and a church called Tipton Chapel that also served as the school. Families raised corn, potatoes, beans, cucumbers, and tomatoes. They cut timber, worked the mills, sold handmade goods, and found other ways to get by. Even moonshine became part of the local economy, helped by the strange advantage of being so close to a state line that enforcement could get messy. For a brief moment, it even looked like Lost Cove might stay connected. In the early 1900s, the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway gave the community a lifeline. Timber could move, people could travel, goods could be sold. For a little while, the Cove no longer felt cut off, but the railroad was not enough. Residents hoped for a short road into the community, just a few miles that might have changed everything. It never came. Timber thinned out, passenger service faded, opportunity narrowed. The school only went so far, and family by family, the place began to empty. The final church service was held in December 1957. On January 1, 1958, Velmer Bailey, his wife, and their children walked out carrying what they could. To me, that is the cruelest part of Lost Cove. It was not a lazy town, and it was not a doomed one from the start. It was a place that could still work, but only if the outside world met it halfway. That never happened. And I think that is why Lost Cove feels heavier than a lot of ghost towns. It was not destroyed by one violent moment. It simply reached the point where the world stopped building a way in. Number 8. Cataloochee. What makes Cataloochee so unsettling is that at first glance it does not look like a place that was lost. It looks preserved, peaceful, almost protected. That is the contradiction at the heart of this valley. One of the largest and most successful communities in the Smokies did not disappear because it collapsed. It disappeared because the land became too valuable in a different way. And this was no small mountain settlement hanging on by a thread. By 1910, Big and Little Cataloochee together had around 1,250 people, making it the largest community in the Smokies. The valley had 3 schools, churches, a post office, general stores, blacksmith work, a grist mill, farmland, livestock, and apple orchards that brought in real money. Some families even hosted travelers and anglers, which meant the beauty of the valley was already part of the local economy long before the national park idea arrived. Cataloochee was not barely making it. It had structure. It had confidence. It had a future people could actually picture. That is the part I think matters most. Remote did not mean backward here. One family built an 11-room, 2-story house with hot and cold running water. Parents came to school on Fridays to hear children recite and sing. Sundays meant church gatherings. As Big Cataloochee filled up, younger families moved into Little Cataloochee and kept the community growing. This was not a place waiting to die. It was still expanding, which is why the next part lands so hard. When plans for Great Smoky Mountains National Park took shape in the 1920s and 1930s, families inside the proposed boundaries were pressured to sell or lost their land through eminent domain. More than 1,100 tracts had to be bought or taken for the park. By 1938, only a handful of residents remained. Cataloochee was not emptied because it failed. It was emptied because the outside world decided the valley had more value as scenery than as a home. And even now, that tension is still there. Beech Grove School still stands. Palmer Chapel is still there. Old frame houses, homesteads, and traces of orchards remain while the forest slowly folds back over the fields. To me, that is what makes Cataloochee heavier than a typical ghost town. It does not feel like a ruin. It feels like a place that was asked to stop being alive so it could become beautiful for someone else. Number 7. Brunswick Town. Walk through Brunswick Town now, and what hits you first is not the sense of a village. It is the sense of aftermath. Brick walls still stand where St. Philip's Church once watched over the port. Old foundations still break the ground along the trail. Traces of Russellborough are still there. The place does not feel empty in the ordinary ghost town sense. It feels like something powerful happened here, and then stopped so completely that only the skeleton was left behind. That feeling makes sense once you know what Brunswick used to be. Founded in 1726, it rose quickly into one of the most important places in colonial North Carolina. By 1729, it was the seat of government for New Hanover Precinct. By 1731, it had become the official port of entry for the Lower Cape Fear. Ships came through here. Trade came through here. Taxes, merchants, governors, court business, wharves, shops, and political influence all ran through this place. For a time, Brunswick was not just part of colonial North Carolina. It helped shape it, and it had a pulse beyond commerce too. In 1766, local leaders and residents resisted the Stamp Act here, turning Brunswick into one of those places where frustration with British rule stopped being private and became public. That detail matters because it reminds you Brunswick was never just a port. It was a place with money, confidence, and nerve. But power has a way of shifting before ruins ever appear. Even before the Revolutionary War, Wilmington was growing, and Brunswick's grip on importance was starting to loosen. Then the war arrived, and suddenly that weakness mattered. In 1776, British forces destroyed much of the town. Whether the sources describe it as fully razed or partly burned, the end result feels the same. Brunswick never truly returned. Then came the final cut. In 1779, the county seat was moved to Lockwood Folly. After that, whatever chance Brunswick still had was gone. By 1783, it lay mostly in ruins. To me, that is what makes Brunswick town so heavy. It was not some minor settlement that quietly faded. It was a place with real authority, real ambition, and real presence. And in the end, it was not only war that killed it. War wounded it, but power leaving finished the job. That is why Brunswick feels less like a forgotten town and more like a fallen capital. Number 6, Portsmouth Village. Some places die all at once. Portsmouth did not. This village faded the way a shoreline changes, little by little, until one day you realize the old shape is gone. That is what makes Portsmouth Village so haunting. Founded in 1753 on Portsmouth Island near Ocracoke Inlet, it once mattered because the sea needed it. Large ships could not always move easily through the shallow waters, so Portsmouth became a lightering port, a place where cargo was transferred to smaller boats and guided inland toward Pamlico Sound. At its peak around 1860, the village had roughly 685 residents. That is a serious number for a settlement on a barrier island. This was not just a cluster of fishing shacks lost in the dunes. Portsmouth had a post office, a church, a school, stores, a marine hospital, homes for pilots, merchants, and fishermen, and later even a U.S. life-saving station. The village lived by shipping, piloting, fishing, and everything tied to a working maritime world. And when shipping began to weaken, Portsmouth did what resilient places do. It adapted. Fishing slowly took over where commerce once ruled, but then the water changed the rules. In 1846, powerful storms opened Hatteras Inlet, and that new inlet gradually pulled commercial importance away from Ocracoke Inlet. At the same time, waters near Portsmouth became less favorable for the kind of shipping that had built the village in the first place. That is the cruel twist here. Portsmouth began dying because the very sea that had once made it important no longer needed it in the same way. And still, it did not disappear. Not then, not even close. The Civil War pushed more people out, railroads and mainland transportation reduced the need for old transfer ports, hurricanes kept punishing the island, isolation kept making life harder, then the signs became painfully quiet. The life-saving station closed in 1937. The post office closed in 1959. One by one, the lights went out. In 1971, after Henry Piggott, the last man living in Portsmouth, died, the final two residents, Elma Dixon and Marion Babb, left the island. That was the end of Portsmouth as a living village. And yet, it still stands in a way that feels almost eerie. Houses, the church, the life-saving station, the cemetery, and old village buildings still remain. To me, that is what makes Portsmouth heavier than most ghost towns. It does not feel erased. It feels paused, like a place where people stepped out for a moment and never found a reason to come back. Number 5. Cape Lookout Village. One of the strangest details about Cape Lookout Village is that parts of it did not simply rot where they stood, they were moved. Around 30 to 40 houses were taken off the Cape and carried to Harker's Island piece by piece. That image tells you almost everything about this place. Cape Lookout was not erased by one catastrophic blow. It was gradually dismantled as if the community itself was being lifted away, board by board. And that is what makes the village so different from the others on this list. In the early 1900s, Cape Lookout was a real working settlement at the Cape, built in large part by families from Shackleford Banks after the brutal storm years of 1896 and 1899. At its peak, it had around 80 residents. For a narrow strip of sand and salt water, that was not insignificant. This was not just a row of lonely cottages facing the wind. The village had a school. It had its own post office, even if only for a short time. It sat beside the lighthouse station, the life-saving station, and later the Coast Guard presence. Families lived by commercial fishing, some livestock grazing, and the maritime work tied to rescue, shipping, and the dangerous waters around the Cape. In a place like that, location was everything. People lived there because being at the Cape mattered. Then that logic quietly broke. By 1905, the life-saving station logbooks were already mentioning gasoline boats. That small change altered the whole future of the village. Once motorboats became practical, fishermen no longer had to live right at Cape Lookout to reach the same fishing grounds. They could stay in Harker's Island or Beaufort, closer to schools, stores, and daily conveniences, and still work the same waters. The isolation that once made Cape Lookout necessary suddenly made it a burden. By the end of the 1919 school year, the school had closed. A visitor in 1921 reported only 2 or 3 families still living there. The village was not wiped out. It was outgrown, and even now, Cape Lookout still lingers. The lighthouse remains, the old life-saving station is still there. Cottages, former Coast Guard buildings, and traces of later wartime structures still stand across the historic district. To me, that is what makes Cape Lookout feel so lonely. It was not destroyed because it was weak, it simply reached the point where life elsewhere became easier, and that kind of ending can feel even sadder than disaster. Number 4. Bethabara. Some towns are destroyed by fire, flood, or war. Bethabara is harder to see coming than that. It did not collapse in one violent moment. It simply had its life pulled out of it piece by piece, until the place that once mattered deeply no longer functioned as a town at all. That is what makes Bethabara so strange. Founded in 1753 by German-speaking Moravians, it was the first Moravian settlement in North Carolina. Its name is often explained as House of Passage, and in a way, that name feels almost prophetic. Bethabara was never just meant to survive on its own. It was the starting point, the staging ground, the place that helped build everything that came after. And for a while, it truly mattered. Bethabara was not just a quiet religious village tucked into the Piedmont. It was a busy trades community. It produced food, finished lumber, and goods that helped support and build other Moravian settlements like Bethania and Salem. Roads spread out from it. Craft work happened there, farming happened there, milling happened there. Pottery remained active there even after other energy had already started shifting away. Bethabara was the kind of place that held a larger world together. That is why its decline feels so different from the others on this list. Bethabara was not crushed from the outside first. It was weakened from within its own system. As Salem grew into the new Moravian center, major trades, economic activity, and much of Bethabara's population moved there. In just a short time, the momentum changed direction. The place that had once fed the network was no longer the place where the future lived. There were other blows, too. During the Revolutionary War, Cornwallis's troops passed through in 1781 and took livestock and supplies. But even that was not the true ending. Bethabara kept going in a reduced form. It lingered as a smaller agricultural community. It kept some working life. It kept some memory. But by around 1820, most of its buildings were gone, and for all practical purposes, it had ceased to exist as a town. And even now, Bethabara is not fully gone. Historic Bethabara Park still preserves surviving Moravian buildings, old foundations, the Potter's House, God's Acre, trails, gardens, and reconstructed defenses. To me, that is what makes Bethabara so heavy. It was the first Moravian foothold in North Carolina, the place that helped make other towns possible. And in the end, it was not destroyed because it failed. It was left behind because the future it helped create chose to live somewhere else. Number 3. Henry River Mill Village. If Henry River Mill Village looks familiar, that may be because it already feels like a place built for collapse. The empty houses, the old company store, the roads curving through a settlement that no longer knows what to do with itself. It is the kind of place that looks cinematic even before you know the story, which is probably why it later became the face of District 12. But the real story is sadder than the set dressing. Henry River was not built to become eerie, it was built to work, and for a long time, it did. When the Henry River Manufacturing Company opened its cotton yarn mill in 1905, an entire village rose with it on the hillside above the Henry Fork River. There were 35 mill houses, a 2-story company store, a boarding house, a bridge, a power dam, and the 3-story brick mill itself. This was not a town that grew by accident. It was a planned industrial world built around one engine and one purpose. That shaped everything. Workers lived in nearly identical houses, walked down to the mill, bought what they needed from the company store, and lived inside a system that was almost complete on its own. Henry River was one of the clearest examples of an isolated industrial village in rural North Carolina, and that was its strength right up until it became its weakness. Because once the mill stopped, there was very little else to carry the place. The mill closed in 1970 after years of pressure from a declining textile economy. That should have ended the story, but it did not. Former workers stayed on, paying low rent and holding on to routine, memory, and whatever scraps of ordinary life still made sense there. That detail matters to me because it means Henry River was not abandoned the second the paycheck stopped. People tried to keep living inside the shell. Then came 1977. The mill building burned, reportedly after a lightning strike, and that feels like the moment the illusion ended. The village had already lost its heart in 1970, but after the fire it lost its shape as a living place. Houses decayed, the boarding house disappeared. More structures fell away over time, and even now the shell is still there. Around 20 of the original mill houses remain. The company store still stands. So do the reservoir, the road patterns, and the overgrown spaces where everyday life used to happen. To me, that is what makes Henry River so bleak. It was never meant to survive as memory alone. Once the mill was gone, the village was really just waiting for time to make the truth visible. Number 2, Pea Ridge. Some communities are abandoned. Pea Ridge was submerged. That is a different kind of disappearance. Not the kind where roofs collapse and weeds take over, but the kind where the land itself goes under, and memory only comes back when the water decides to give a little of it back. That is what makes Pea Ridge so unsettling. This was not just a few scattered farmhouses hidden off some forgotten back road. Pea Ridge grew along Pea Ridge Road, once an important route through Chatham County and part of the larger New Hope Valley. The land there was rich, built up over years of flooding and silt, and families held on to it through generations. This was working ground, real ground, the kind people trusted with their lives. And that matters because Pea Ridge was never the sort of place people simply drifted away from. This was an agricultural community shaped by routine, labor, and inheritance. People farmed that low, fertile land through depression years, through storms, through hard seasons, and through the kind of work that leaves itself in your hands and back. The value of Pea Ridge was not in a big port or a mill. It was in the bond between people and land. Then came the decision that changed everything. After major flooding in the 1940s, federal plans for flood control moved forward. The New Hope Reservoir project was approved, construction began in the late 1960s, and the reservoir later became B. Everett Jordan Lake. By the time the lake reached normal operating levels in 1982, communities like Pea Ridge had been erased from the map above water. Roads, trees, yards, foundations, and the physical shape of daily life disappeared beneath the lake. And the leaving was not simple. Families had to sell homes and land that had been in their bloodlines for generations. Some had family graves on private property. Many believed they were paid far less than the true value of what they lost. That is what gives Pea Ridge its weight. It did not die because it failed. It was sacrificed to make something larger and more useful for the region. And even now it is not entirely gone. When water levels drop low enough, old foundations, road traces, scattered artifacts, and bits of the drowned landscape begin to appear again. To me, that is what makes Pea Ridge harder to shake than a normal ghost town. It is not just abandoned, it is buried. And when the lake recedes, it feels less like ruins are being uncovered and more like a memory is trying to breathe. Number 1. Richmond. Some towns die slowly enough for people to watch it happen. Richmond did not. Its ending feels almost too clean, too sudden, too final, for a place that once held real authority. That is what makes it so unsettling. This was not some nameless stop in the backcountry. Richmond was once the seat of Surrey County. And then, after history had already started pulling power away from it, a cyclone seems to have finished the job in one violent stroke. That is the strange shape of Richmond's story. It began with weight. In 1779, the courthouse for Surrey County was established there on land tied to Colonel Martin Armstrong and William Shepherd. In a young county still defining itself, that mattered. A county seat was not just a point on a map. It was where legal disputes were handled, public business was done, militia concerns passed through, and local authority took physical form. Richmond may not have been a giant town in the way modern viewers imagine, but it was important. It had a civic gravity that made people come to it. And that is exactly why its disappearance feels wrong, because Richmond did not hold that role forever. After Stokes County was split off in 1789, the location no longer made sense as the center of government for the changing region. The court moved on to Rockford, and Richmond lost the one thing that had made it more than just another settlement. In a way, the town's political soul was removed decades before its body was erased. Then came the final blow. According to Encyclopedia, Richmond was completely destroyed by a cyclone in or soon after August 1830, and the site was abandoned. That is the line that makes this case hit so hard. Not decline, not gradual collapse, not some long chain of economic weakness. A cyclone. One brutal event after the town had already faded enough for history to stop protecting it. And what makes Richmond even more eerie is what is not there now. With places like Portsmouth or Henry River, you can still point to standing houses, churches, or old foundations. Richmond offers almost none of that. Its site is remembered more through records, township names, and historical notes than through ruins you can walk through. To me, that absence is the most haunting part. Richmond was once important enough to anchor a county, and now it survives mostly as an idea, as if history dimmed it first and the wind erased the rest. These places may be abandoned now, but none of them were meaningless. Some were erased by water, some by war, some by industry collapsing, and some simply by a world that stopped needing them. And maybe that is the strangest part of North Carolina's forgotten towns. They did not all die the same way, but they all leave behind the same question. How does a place full of work, memory, and ordinary life become silence? Which one stayed with you the most, and which story hit harder than you expected? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more hidden history like this, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.